When your own family becomes your silent enemy is not a phrase I ever imagined would one day define my life. Yet as I speak these words now, I realize it is the most honest title my story could ever carry, because I am Davis Black, and this is not fiction to me. It is the echo of wounds that never fully healed, the kind inflicted not by strangers, but by those whose blood runs alongside yours. Those who smile at you at the dinner table while quietly sharpening the knives meant for your back. I grew up believing family was a sanctuary, a place where love was unconditional and loyalty was unquestioned. And for many years I defended that belief even when cracks began to show, because it is easier to doubt yourself than to accept that the people who raised you could ever wish you harm. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Conversations became careful, silences grew heavier, and my success, started to feel like an unspoken crime, as if every step forward I took was a reminder to them of paths they never dared to walk. And at first it was subtle, a missed celebration, a compliment wrapped in sarcasm, advice that sounded more like warnings. But then the sabotage began wearing the mask of concern. Opportunities disappeared without explanation. Rumors about me circulated before I even realized I was being discussed, and whenever I tried to confront it, I was told I was overthinking, imagining things, being ungrateful, and that gaslighting cut deeper than any open insult because it made me question my sanity, my memories, my instincts. Until one night, I overheard a conversation that shattered the last piece of innocence I had left, hearing my own name spoken with resentment, my dreams dismissed as arrogance, my struggles mocked as deserved punishment, and in that moment the truth settled into my bones like ice. I was not surrounded by enemies because I failed them. I was surrounded by enemies because I dared to rise. And the most painful realization was understanding that betrayal hurts most when it comes from those who know exactly where you are vulnerable, who remember your childhood fears, your lowest moments, and choose to weaponize them. And for a long time I stayed silent, hoping things would change, hoping love would eventually win. But silence only fed their power, and the more I endured, the more I shrank, until one day I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, a man who had been taught to apologize for existing, to dim his light so others could feel brighter, and that was the day I chose myself, not with anger, not with revenge, but with distance, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the people who taught you how to walk, and leaving was not easy. It felt like grief mixed with guilt, like abandoning a part of my identity. But as time passed, clarity replaced confusion, peace replaced anxiety, and I learned a truth no one prepares you for. That family is not defined by blood alone, but by behavior, by respect, by who celebrates your growth instead of resenting it. And today when I tell my story, I don't do it to accuse or to shame, but to warn and to heal, to let others know that if the voices trying to break you sound familiar, it does not mean you are wrong. It means you are strong. And if your own family becomes your silent enemy, choosing yourself is not betrayal. It is survival, because sometimes the most powerful act of love is refusing to let anyone, even those closest to you, destroy the person you were meant to become. And even after I walked away, the story did not end there, because distance does not instantly erase damage. It only gives you the silence needed to finally hear your own thoughts. And in that silence, I began to understand how deeply their quiet hostility had shaped me, how I had learned to doubt joy, to brace myself during good moments as if happiness were a trap that would soon be punished. And rebuilding myself felt like learning to breathe with lungs that had forgotten how air was supposed to feel, because healing is not a straight road. It is a series of relapses into old guilt, late nights questioning whether I was cruel for choosing peace over loyalty, and mornings where I reminded myself that love should never feel like a battlefield. And yet the suspense of my life lingered, because part of me always feared their shadows would return, that they would resurface when I least expected it. And they did, not with apologies, not with reflection, but with attempts to reclaim control, sudden messages coded in nostalgia, selective memories of how close we once were, and accusations that my absence was proof of my selfishness. But this time I saw clearly, because growth gives you a different lens, one that recognizes manipulation disguised as affection. And for the first time, I didn't explain myself. didn't defend my choices, didn't beg to be understood. I simply remained firm, and that quiet strength unsettled them more than any argument ever could, because people who thrive on your weakness panic when they no longer have access to it. And as the years passed, I built a life stitched together by chosen connections, friends who listened without judging, mentors who guided without competing, and love that didn't feel conditional. And through them, I learned another moral truth. That pain does not disqualify you from peace. It prepares you for it. And the suspense of my journey slowly transformed into purpose because I began to speak about what I had survived, not publicly at first, but in intimate conversations where others would lower their voices and confess similar stories, stories of family jealousy, emotional neglect, silent cruelty. And in those moments I realized how common this tragedy truly is. How many people are quietly fighting wars inside homes that appear perfectly normal from the outside? And if there is one lesson my life has carved into me, it is this. Not every wound bleeds, not every enemy shouts, and not every betrayal announces itself loudly. Some simply smile, stay close, and wait for you to break. And I am Davis Black, standing here not as a victim, but as proof. Proof that you can outgrow the environment that tried to suffocate you. Proof that loyalty to yourself is not abandonment of others. And proof that even when your own family becomes your silent enemy, your story does not end in bitterness. It evolves into wisdom, resilience, and a quiet, unshakable strength that no one can ever take away from you again. And even now, as I continue telling this story, I realize how layered the aftermath truly was. Because survival is only the first chapter and living fully is an entirely different battle, one that required me to unlearn the instincts drilled into me by years of emotional warfare, instincts that told me to expect betrayal, to mistrust kindness, to keep score in relationships as if love were a transaction that could suddenly turn hostile. And there were moments when the past crept back in unexpected ways, like flinching at raised voices even when no anger was present, or feeling undeserving when praise came without strings attached. And those moments reminded me that the deepest scars are invisible, carried quietly, misunderstood by those who have never had to escape the very people meant to protect them. And sometimes I wondered if forgiveness was necessary for healing, because society teaches us that closure only comes when we forgive those who hurt us. But I learned that forgiveness without accountability can feel like self-betrayal, so instead I chose understanding. Without reconciliation, acceptance without access. And that decision became my shield, because I no longer needed their validation to feel whole. And the suspense that once haunted my nights slowly shifted into awareness, an awareness that not everyone will celebrate your evolution, especially those who benefited from your silence. And this realization freed me from the illusion that love must always be preserved at the cost of self-respect. And as time moved forward, I began to recognize how my story carried a moral weight larger than my own pain, because I started meeting people who saw themselves in my words, who confessed they stayed trapped out of fear, guilt, or tradition, believing endurance was a virtue even when it was destroying them. And I wanted them to know that strength is not measured by how much pain you tolerate, but by how bravely you choose a life that doesn't require constant survival. And there were days when memories still stung, when holidays felt hollow, when the absence of family echoed louder than their presence ever had. But even in that loneliness, there was honesty, a peace rooted in authenticity rather than obligation. And I learned that sometimes loneliness is the price of freedom, but it is far less costly than living a lie. And as I rebuilt myself, I also rebuilt my definition of family, realizing it could be formed through shared values rather than shared blood, through mutual respect rather than forced loyalty. And this transformation did not erase my past, it reframed it, turning pain into perspective and betrayal into boundaries. And if my life holds any suspense now, it is no longer the fear of being destroyed, but the quiet anticipation of how far I can go without the weight of invisible enemies pulling me back, because I am no longer running from who I was. I am walking toward who I was always meant to be. And this story, my story, is not a warning filled with bitterness, but a testimony carved from truth, that even when your own family becomes your silent enemy, you can still reclaim your voice, redefine your worth, and write an ending that is not shaped by their resentment, but by your resilience, because I am Davis Black, and this is how I learned that the strongest revenge is not success alone, but peace, clarity, and the courage to live unapologetically in a world that once tried to silence you. And yet even peace has its own echoes. Because once the noise of constant conflict fades, you are left alone with memories that no longer scream but whisper, asking to be acknowledged. And there were nights when I lay awake realizing how deeply the idea of family had once defined my self-worth, how much of my identity was built around pleasing people who never intended to be pleased, and dismantling that mindset felt like dismantling a house brick by brick, painful, slow, and exhausting, but necessary if I ever wanted to build something stable in its place. And I began to notice how often society romanticizes sacrifice without questioning who benefits from it, how easily we praise endurance while ignoring the quiet destruction it causes, and for the first time I allowed myself to feel anger. Not the explosive kind, but the honest kind, the kind that says what happened was not acceptable, and that acknowledgement became a turning point. Because healing does not begin with denial, it begins with truth, and as I embraced that truth, the suspense of my past transformed into awareness of patterns that had repeated across generations, where unresolved pain disguised itself as control, jealousy, or emotional neglect, and understanding this didn't excuse their behavior, but it freed me from carrying blame that was never mine, and slowly I learned to trust again, not blindly, but wisely, choosing relationships that felt safe rather than familiar, because familiarity had once led me into emotional traps I mistook for love. And with every healthy connection I formed, I felt a quiet confirmation that I was not broken, that my need for respect and kindness was not excessive, but human. And there were moments when I questioned whether telling my story mattered at all, whether my words could truly help anyone else. But each time someone said, "I thought I was alone until I heard you," I knew my pain had found purpose, and that purpose softened the sharpest edges of my past. And now when I reflect on everything I endured, I no longer see myself as someone who was rejected by family, but as someone who was redirected toward a life that demanded authenticity over approval. And the moral I carry with me is simple yet heavy. Love that demands your silence is not love. Loyalty that requires self-destruction is not loyalty. And family that thrives on your suffering forfeits the right to your presence. And as I move forward, I do so without hatred, without the need to prove anything, because I have learned that closure does not always come from conversations. Sometimes it comes from growth so profound that the past no longer recognizes you. And if there is suspense left in my story, it lies only in the future I continue to create, one choice at a time, guided by boundaries, self-respect, and the quiet strength earned through survival. Because I am Davis Black, and this is the part of my journey where pain no longer writes the narrative, where betrayal no longer defines the plot, and where even the deepest wounds become chapters of wisdom, reminding me that when your own family becomes your silent enemy, choosing peace is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of finally living it. And as life continued to unfold, I began to notice something quietly powerful happening within me, something I had never been taught to value before. Self-trust, the ability to listen to my instincts without immediately dismissing them as overreactions or weakness, because for years my emotions had been questioned, minimized, and reshaped by others until I learned to distrust my own inner voice. And reclaiming it felt like meeting an old friend I had abandoned out of fear, and with that trust came clarity, a sharp awareness of how deeply emotional neglect can shape a person's future, how it teaches you to overgive, to tolerate disrespect, to stay in places long after they stop being safe. And recognizing those patterns allowed me to interrupt them before they could define the rest of my life. And there was a strange kind of suspense in that awareness, because growth often forces you to face crossroads where old habits invite you back with familiarity, while new paths demand courage and uncertainty. And many times I stood at those crossroads trembling, choosing differently than before, choosing not to explain myself endlessly, choosing not to seek permission to exist as I am, choosing not to confuse obligation with love, and each choice strengthened me, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a foundation setting beneath the surface. And I began to understand that some families do not break you all at once, They erode you slowly, through comparison, silence, conditional affection, and subtle competition, until you forget what being supported ever felt like. And this realization didn't make me bitter, it made me intentional. Intentional about how I show up for others. Intentional about never becoming the kind of person who wounds in silence. And as I build a life guided by these values, I also learned to grieve properly, not just the people I lost, but the version of family I once hoped for. And I stumbled at times, falling into old patterns of self-doubt, questioning whether I deserved stability, whether happiness would last, whether trusting again was foolish. But each setback became a lesson rather than a sentence. And with every lesson, I grew more compassionate toward myself, understanding that healing is not about becoming invulnerable, but about becoming resilient. And the suspense of my story transformed once more, no longer rooted in fear of betrayal, but in the uncertainty of growth. Because growth demands you shed identities that once kept you safe, even if they were painful. And there were moments when my family's absence still ached, especially during milestones I once imagined sharing with them. Yet even in that ache there was clarity, because longing no longer tempted me back into environments that required my silence. And I learned that missing people does not mean you must return to the harm they caused. And that realization gave me emotional maturity I never learned in childhood. And as I continued forward, I began to mentor others quietly, not as an expert, but as someone who understands the weight of choosing yourself when the world tells you to endure. And in those shared moments, I saw reflections of my former self, confused, loyal to a fault, afraid of being labeled selfish. And each reflection reminded me how far I had come, and how necessary it is to speak about these experiences without shame, because silence protects abusers more than it protects families. And the moral of my journey deepened with time. Not every broken bond needs repair, some need release. And not every ending is a failure, some are acts of self-respect. And today I walk with a quiet confidence, not loud, not arrogant, but grounded, knowing that my value is intrinsic, not negotiable, and that no one has the right to diminish it, no matter how close their title once placed them to my life. And if my story continues beyond this moment, it will be written with intention, honesty, and boundaries, because I am Davis Black, and I have learned that when your own family becomes your silent enemy, survival teaches you strength, healing teaches you wisdom, and choosing yourself teaches you how to finally live without fear. And as I stand here now, reflecting on everything this journey carved into me, I understand that healing does not erase the past, it reshapes how you carry it. And there is a quiet responsibility that comes with survival, a responsibility to remain honest even when honesty is uncomfortable, because truth is the only thing that ever truly set me free. And for a long time I mistook peace for forgetting. But peace actually came when I stopped running from my story and started owning it without shame, without exaggeration, and without fear of who it might expose. And that ownership brought a depth to my character I never could have gained in comfort, teaching me patience, emotional intelligence, and the courage to walk alone when necessary. And there were still moments when old wounds tried to reopen, when a familiar tone or memory stirred doubt. But now I recognize those moments as echoes, not commands, reminders of where I had been, not where I belonged, and the suspense of my life no longer felt like waiting for something bad to happen, but like anticipation for growth yet to come, because once you survive betrayal, you stop underestimating yourself, and you stop overestimating the power others have over you. And I learned that boundaries are not walls built from bitterness. They are doors with locks that you control, and controlling access to your life is not cruelty. It is wisdom earned the hard way. And as I share this story, I do so knowing that many listening will recognize parts of themselves in my words, will feel seen in ways they never felt within their own homes. And if my story does anything, I hope it reminds you that truth is not negative, it is not hateful, and it is not destructive. Truth is clarity, truth is healing, and truth is the foundation of real growth, which is why I believe so deeply in speaking openly about realities people are taught to hide, and why platforms that value honesty matter so much in a world addicted to appearances. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you feel less alone, less confused, or more aware of your own worth, then I ask you to support the Black Relation channel. not because it spreads hate, but because black here means truth, raw and unfiltered, the kind of truth that exposes wounds so they can finally heal, the kind of truth that challenges silence, denial, and emotional injustice. And by supporting Black Relation, you support conversations that free people from invisible suffering. Because I am Davis Black, and this story exists not to divide, but to awaken, not to accuse, but to illuminate, and not to dwell in pain, but to transform it into understanding, strength, and truth.